First of all, the title, How Come Information? It's, it's derived from the title of a famous paper by John Wheeler, this How Come the Quantum? And actually all my talk, it's the kind of contribution that want to invite you to reflect on the philosophical aspect of this of information. And the outline, as you can see, try to connect Wheeler's it from famous motto, it from bit, and then the Plato's theory of form. So let's start from it from bit. Why it from bit? Well, because in Wheeler's eyes, the universe and all that it contains, it, may arise from the myriad yes-no choices of measurement, that is the bits. Now, Wheeler emphasized his debt somehow to Niels Bohr because he's actually elaborated his philosophical view on the reflection of Niels Bohr. And Niels Bohr wrestled for most of his life with the question of how acts of measurement or registration may affect reality. It's registration that changes potentiality into actuality. And Wheeler says, I build only a little on the structure of Bohr's thinking when I suggest that we may never understand this strange thing, the quantum, until we understand how information may underlie reality. So information, and this is what Wheeler stressed, may not be just what we learn about the world, it may be what makes the world. Now, my aim is to highlight how the image of the world depicted by modern physics, to the extent that it rests on what we now term information, it might have its root in Plato's theory of forms. Actually, in this direction, also Max Bergen had an interesting paper and the reflection. So how does modern physics stretch human understanding of reality, of human understanding of knowledge? Well, first, it was Minkowski's idea to join space and time and see events as the essential stuff of physics. From now onwards, wrote Minkowski, space by itself and time by itself will recede completely to become mere shadows, and only a type of union of the two will still stand independently on its own. Then is a stress, let us imagine that everywhere and at any time, something perceivable exists. In order not to say matter or electricity, I will use the word substance for that thing. We then get an image, so to say, of the eternal course of life, of the substantial point, a curve in the world, a word line. And the whole world presents itself as resolved into such word lines. And I want to say in advance that in my understanding, the laws of physics can find their most complete expression as interrelations between these word lines. Well, as we know, every event marks a point in space-time, namely in the frame of an observer. And different observers measure different values of the space-time distances between pairs of events, but the space-time interval has the same value for all the observer. Now we are in the realm of relativity, of course. Rigid rods and clocks allow every observer to chart a region of the world, but there is no way to distinguish one frame from another because space is empty. Special relativity, in fact, relies on empty space to keep the light velocity invariant. This allows the world of Galileo and Newton to be resolved into a multiplicity of local perspectives. And yet, in the realm of relativity, the subject observer is still separated from the observed system, and the observed value of physical quantities are taken as objective properties of the system, as elements of physical reality. Quantum physics asks for a deepening of the foundation of physical knowledge. Indeed, following Bohr, in spite of the great demands that theory of relativity makes upon our power of abstraction, the conception of the objective reality of the phenomena open to observation is still rigidly maintained. As Einstein has emphasized, the assumption that any observation ultimately depends upon the coincidence in space and time of the object and the means of observation, and that therefore any observation is definable independently of the reference system of the observer, is indeed fundamental for the world theory of relativity. However, since the discovery of the quantum of action, we know that the classical ideal cannot be attained in the description of atomic phenomena. Any conclusion with regards to the dynamical behavior of the individual units obviously necessitates of a complete renunciation of following their course in space and time. Now, what does it mean that the classical idea of an objective reality of the phenomenon open to observation can no longer be attained? Well, it means to recognize the necessity of revising the conditions of observability of phenomena, which is to say, in line with Kant, the conditions of possibility of knowledge. This requirement for boundless conditions on observability will be fulfilled by Heisenberg's uncertainty relation. Now, in his book, Reality is Not Like It Seems, Carlo Rovelli tells us that the key insight into the quantum world comes to Heisenberg one night in the dark
Rossella,
behind.
I'm sorry, yes? We lost your slides.
No, has to be dark.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Has to be dark. Thank you. This was because, well, as I was saying, the key insight into the quantum world comes to Heisenberg one night in the park behind the Copenhagen Institute of Physics. In 1925, there are only sporadic stream slumps casting dim islands of light here and there. Heisenberg is working in the darkness when suddenly he sees a figure of a man appears beneath the lamp, then disappear into the dark before reappearing and then vanishing again beneath another lamp, and so on. So Heisenberg was seeing this appearing of this figure in the night. It's evident, Heisenberg thinks, that the man does not actually vanish and reappear. Indeed, the man trajectory can be easily reconstructed. A man is not a shadow, is a substantial object, big and heavy. And big and heavy objects do not simply appear and vanish. But how do we know about electrons? What if its electrons could vanish and reappear? What if between one interaction with something and another with something else, the electron could literally be nowhere? What if the electron could be something that manifests itself only when it interacts? Well, after plunging into calculation, Heisenberg would emerge with a concerting theory in which electrons, namely material particles, are described not by their position at every moment, but only by their position at particular instants, the instance in which they interact with something else. Here is the hardest lesson from quantum mechanics, the relational aspect of things. Electrons don't always exist. They exist when they interact. Well, in the world described by quantum mechanics, there is no reality except in the relations between physical systems. it isn't things that enter into relation, but rather they enter relations that ground the notion of things. The word of quantum mechanics is not a word of object, it's a word of events. Things are built by the happening of elementary events. So the quantum world, let's see the characteristic of the quantum world. The quantum mechanics reveals to us that the more we look at the detail of the world, the less constant it is. The world is not made up of tiny ripples. It's a world of vibration, a continuous fluctuation, a microscopic warming of fleeting micro events. This macro, oh, something, okay. I cannot, okay. This quantum fluctuation reveals empty space to be, in fact, a cauldron of activity. From quantum fluctuation come measurable properties of physical system and not yet measurable property of space-time itself. Now, the question is, how far is from Plato's words? May not such a cauldron of activity be reminiscent of the Timaeus Cora, that space as a formative matter, or that space as a kind of field of energy form? Well, let's go back to the Timaeus, and the way in which Plato described the Chora, he said, as for the nature which receives all material things, we must call it always the same, for it never departs from its own function. It ever receives all things into it and has nowhere any form, in any wise like the oath of the shapes that enter into it. For it, at the substance wherein all things are naturally molded, being steered and informed by the entering shapes, and owing to them, it appears different from time to time. And therefore, he said, we shall not err in affirming it to be a viewless nature and formless, all receiving in some manner, most bewildering and hard to comprehend, partaking of the intelligible. Well, now what I would like to focus on is the art of producing appearance, the mimesis, the way in which the reason why the demiurge come into action in the Timaeus. And actually, mimesis is not the art of imitating something, but it's the art of producing something, because it's of producing appearance, because actually the idea that the demiurge is supposed to imitate, to make visible, are invisible for everybody, and therefore also for the demiurge. So at the beginning, according to the Timaeus telling, there are being and space and becoming, and three in numbers and threefold nature, even before the heavens were created. And the art of becoming herself shaken by the entering form and by the motions shaking them again in turn. So in a sense, we might be tempted to say that Plato's theory of form, based on the clear separation between the intelligible world and the sensible world, idea and appearance, is functional to his theory of creative love. It's in the nature of love to compose an original division and trigger a generative force. For Plato, love is the love of generation and of birth in beauty. Beauty, then, is the goddess of parturition who guards the divine demiurge and the artist. It's love that moves the demiurge to create time first, and then model the essential elements of nature on the perfect symmetry of regular polyhedra. It's in the conceiving power that drives the painter to return immortality to those bodily forms which excel, as Timaeus said, in beauty. Thus, the truth of the idea and the beauty of appearance as united through the mathematical form, which nonetheless unveil the boundless energy field of becoming. The other point that I want to stress is that time is a condition of appearance. And so this is the first creation of the demiurge, because the demiurge has to create first time, because the nature of the idea was eternal, but to bestow this attribute altogether upon a created thing was impossible. And therefore, what the first step of the demiurge creation is to make a moving image of the eternity. So now, in contrast, after saying about the art of appearance in the Timeo, in contrast with the demiurge, the painter can rely on visible things and can rely on the visible beauty of natural form. And now the art of measuring, teams up with the art of producing appearances. And the artists so can the artistic representation can pave the way for the scientific representation. The painter, as Leonardo says, ought to study. Now the painter can study the beauty of nature and can study universal nature and reason much within himself on all he sees, making use of the most excellent part that compose the special of every object before him. Now, study means observing and dissecting nature in order to create something new. And so the painter can elaborate on the natural form of the Timaeus and create other forms constructing with his mind. So the mind of the painter should be like a mirror, said Leonardo, which always takes the color of the object it reflects, and it's filled with the image of as many objects as are in front of it. Therefore, you must know that you cannot be a good painter unless you are a universal master to represent by your art every kind of form produced by nature. And this you will not know how to do unless you see them and retain it in your mind. So now the painter becomes a universal master to represent. And then we can say that the painter has to be an analogical computer. And in fact, the painter, as Leonardo said, is lord of all types of people and think. And in fact, whatever exists in the universe, in essence, in appearance, in the imagination, the painter has first in his mind and then in his hand. And they are of such excellence that they can present a proportional, harmonious view of the whole that can be seen simultaneously at one's glance, just as things in nature. So elaborating on the natural form, there are finite. The imagination and the mind of the painter, once it's become a universal master of the representation, is to create an infinite and numberless form, starting from the form that he can recognize in nature. And in this way, painting became a science. And actually, this is the vision of Leonardo. The painter is a science. If you despise painting, which is the sole imitator of all the visible work of nature, you certainly will be despising a subtle invention which brings philosophy and subtle speculation to bear on the nature of all forms, sea and lands and plants, animals, grasses and flowers, which are enveloped in the shade of light. Truly, painting is a science, the true born child of nature, for painting is born from nature. Now, in a sense, the perspective is reversed, because if the work of the demiurge was to make visible the beauty and the truth of the idea, and in order to do this, he had to create time. And time, that means temporary things, is the condition for visible, for the visible work, for the visible forms. Now, actually, painting, the painter can somehow, the effort of the painter is to preserve the transient beauty of mortals and endow it with a permanence greater than the work of nature. In a sense, is to make them immortal and eternal, even of course in as long as possible. Here we can see that the reason for Bernard Berenson to regard the main achievement of visual art as sight enhancing, then the ambition to invent a machine for the perfect imitation of mind appears to flow as a logical consequence from the ambition to invent a device for the perfect imitation of nature. So the question, can an artist create? Now the question becomes, can a machine think? And again, the point is to play the imitation game. If to create means to generate visible forms, to think is to generate intelligible structures. And actually, what we learned from the reflection of Turing is that machine can carry something which ought to be described as thinking, even though perhaps machine has doing something very different from what man do. So the point is that to recognize and to agree on what we mean by thinking and in what a machine can do. And the great positive reason following Turing for believing in the possibility of making thinking machinery is the fact that it's possible to make machinery to imitate any small part of man. But then the big problem is the problem of interference, because as I said, in so far as a man is a machine, is one that is subject to very much interference. In fact, interference will be the rule rather than the exception. He is in frequent communication with other men and is continually receiving visual and other stimuli, which themselves constitute a form of interference. It will only be when a man is concentrating with a view to eliminating the stimuli or distraction that is approximate a machine without interference. But a machine with interference is not compatible with the classical model of a Turing machine, not even with a probabilistic Turing machine when interference stems from quantum interaction. Now, there are 2 points that could deserve a discussion, but I will skip the discussion about man and machine and will concentrate on nature and machine. So can a Turing machine simulate quantum physics? And then we know from, actually this was the answer given in 1922 by Feynman. It turns out that we can simulate quantum physics with a quantum computer, which is a quantum system built on quantum computers element which obey quantum mechanical laws. It's not a Turing machine, but a machine of a different kind. This machine of a different kind that somehow triggered all the discussion, the development of quantum computation and quantum information, then can be revised again, considering what emerged from quantum randomness. And if now the question would be if God can play dice, because the point can play dice with the universe, because the point is how the prediction that quantum computation allows us to do are not compatible with the prediction of probability or classical probability theory. But this also revealed that actually is the act of measurement that create the value of measurement somehow. And here, all this comes from the discussion that was opened by the EPR argument. As we know, the criterion for physical reality given by EPR is that if we, without in any way disturbing a system, we can predict with certainty the value of a physical quantity, then there exists an element of physical reality corresponding to this physical quantity. The EPR argument was turned into a refutable proposition by John Bell, and it has been shown that Bell's inequalities is inconsistent with assigning numerical values to physical quantities prior to this value being actually registered. So quantum correlation allows God to be a gambler. But if there exists no element of physical reality prior to measurement, then is the act of measurement that then generates the value of a physical quantity that brings an element of physical reality into being. So going back to the Wheeler's reflection, the history of the universe, and he used this symbolic image to trace the evolution of the universe from small to large, time enough for life and mind to develop, finally, the eye of the observer. And by looking back now, by observing what happened in the earliest days of the universe, we give reality to those days. The history of the universe is not one thing happening after another. It's a totality in which what happens now gives reality to what happened then, perhaps even determine what happened then. And so going back to it from bit, so how can an act of measurement or registration affect reality? Well, actually, only when a photon or an electron, when a photon is absorbed or when an electron is viewed and thereby measured, and a splittable bit of information is added to what we know about the world. And at the same time, that bit of information determines the structure of one small part of the world. It creates the reality of the time and place of that photon's interaction, of that quantum event. It's registration then, whether by a person or a device, that changes potentiality into actuality. But not all potentiality can be converted to actuality in any finite time. In fact, information is finite and information is changeable. And so reality is informed by acts of measurement. And with Plato's words, owing to them, it appears different from time to time. So being is becoming, and reality can be seen as information. Thank you for your attention.